All aboard. This Unitarian Universalist train is headed to racial justice. Last call. Anyone not getting on now will be left behind. These were words that sounded out from a workshop at a ministerial gathering from about 5 years ago. The white minister who spoke those words was a well-regarded and influential leader in racial justice work. Then there was a question from one of my esteemed colleagues, a black minister, and asked, what about the people not getting on the train? There are some that could get on. All they need is a little help. We can't just leave them behind, can we? Aren't they worthy of our care and community? We Unitarian Universalists fully know that we cannot relive the past, but that we can create a kinder and more equitable future. In our haste, we can't leave people behind. Our train, this congregation, and Unitarian Universalism has been influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement, the largest justice movement in our nation's history by sheer numbers of participants. Any of you remember when Trayvon Martin was killed while walking home from a store in Florida? It was in 2012. A self-appointed security vigilante thought that the black teen in a hoodie looked suspicious and called 911. Even though the operator told him to wait for the police to arrive, the caller got into a scuffle with Trayvon and killed him. I was in seminary in Chicago at the time, and we were all studying anti-racism and social justice to prepare to become UU ministers. We marched, beginning in the Loop, shouting justice for Trayvon. People wore hoodies, carrying bags of Skittles and cans of iced tea, things that he had just bought at a convenience store. In 2013, Patrice Cullors tweeted out hashtag Black Lives Matter after Trayvon Martin's killer was acquitted. That simple hashtag gave a name to a new racial justice movement. That movement really took off a year later after a police officer killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. You might remember images from that time, protesters going against militarized police. It looked like a war zone. At that time, I attended a call with clergy who were serving congregations in and around Ferguson, Missouri, and I knew from that call that this was a different type of justice movement. The clergy were not leading it. We were to be in the background. I followed that lead and worked with Black activists and helped organize in Albuquerque at that time. Unitarian Universalist churches were some of the first religious groups to publicly support Black Lives Matter, and in some cases, their buildings were vandalized because of it. Before I accepted the call to serve here, the interim minister, Reverend Joel Miller, spoke about Black Lives Matter. Mark Berninghausen got some banners made. The Reverend David Weisbard preached a sermon on that topic. And I know that in that summer of 2016, there were a number of protests following the police killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. In the fall of 2016, a young woman came up to me and asked me what our congregation was doing to support Black Lives Matter. I was like, I don't know. I just got here. I brought this up to church council, and they eventually voted to be in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement. And around that time, we hosted a community event. It was a panel discussion of current and former SLU and SUNY Potsdam students of color. We wanted to hear their stories and what types of racism that was affecting them here in Canton. Another thing we did was create a North Country chapter of Surge, showing up for racial justice, a white allies group. There were about 100 people at our first meeting in November of 2016, just weeks after Donald Trump was elected. Serge used a snowflake model of leadership. It seemed as if there was no centralized leadership, and we were to all become leaders ourselves. This was similar to the decentralized nature of the Black Lives Matter movement. And at the time, I thought, hey, it's okay. We put up a Black Lives Matter banner in 2017, which had to be replaced because according to Village Code, it had too many colors. I wanted all of us to march for Black Lives Matter with signs in the Dairy Princess Parade in June of 2017, but it was deemed too risky. Only in America does the phrase Black Lives Matter become controversial. Instead, we held up signs with a bunch of other different phrases, including Black Lives Matter. In 2017, the Unitarian Universalist Association had its own controversy. People of color were angered that a white male was hired over a woman of color. This was brought up directly to the Reverend Peter Morales, the first Latino president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And he was accused, along with the UUA, of participating in the culture of white supremacy. And let's just say Peter didn't react very pastorally and ended up resigning 3 months before his term was up. Everyone was getting on a new racial justice train. I led a series of workshops here entitled Let's Talk About Race. If you remember, there were 2 Sunday teachings on dismantling the culture of white supremacy that we had here. Our social justice initiative in 2019 was on ending mass incarceration, which was definitely influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement. And then there was May 2020. George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Nationwide protests erupted. Black Lives Matter was everywhere. We rang the bells of our church for 9 minutes each day, the amount of time the police officer's knee was on Floyd's neck. We organized a protest across the street in the Village Green, which made NPR news. Later that year, some of us participated in a group that audited our local police department. I can tell you, it felt really good to be part of that movement. It seemed that we were on the right side of history, and I don't know, speaking the right words at the right time. Polls show that 2/3 of Americans supported Black Lives Matter. Even police were kneeling at events in support of Black Lives Matter. Then, often written with black Sharpies on cardboard, a demand emerged: defund the police. Some of my colleagues were preaching sermons in support of this. Defund the police only made sense to me if it meant let's take some of the money going to police departments and reallocate it to mental health and social workers. However, an opinion piece in the New York Times that was entitled, "Yes, we mean literally abolish the police," showed that what Black Lives Matter really meant was they really wanted to abolish the police altogether. Of course, the article had no substantive plan on how that was to be accomplished. Defunding the police was unachievable, to say the least. Polls at the time showed that the majority of Blacks didn't want less police. They actually wanted more, less racist and better trained police. As far as I can tell, defund the police came from the left's revolution mythology. There would first be a fall of capitalism and the rise of some sort of socialist state with no poverty. Then there would be no need for police. Defund the police was a radical leftist fantasy. It was sort of a purity test as well. Are you really for Black Lives Matter or not? Not only was it unachievable, but it was very, very divisive. Around the same time, Congress introduced a George Floyd bill that would have made chokeholds illegal and banned policies that shielded on-duty officers from being held personally accountable in civil rights lawsuits. This was a no-nonsense bill that never got passed. Now, this is just one example and a very short glimpse and brief history of the movement, but it shows how far removed the Black Lives Matter was from the Black experience in our country. Black Americans are one of the solid bases of the Democratic Party, and according to numerous polls, the majority are left of center, but not radical leftists. I have no doubt the good of the Black Lives Matter movement. The calls for Black liberation have been heard. There are more body cameras on police officers, and police are being held accountable. But BLM didn't have a major piece of legislation to hang its hat on. Perhaps a decentralized justice movement doesn't work. It needs more formal leadership structures. I mean, just think if our congregation had no policies, no bylaws, and no elected leaders. And any social justice movement needs to make demands that are achievable and that a wide variety of folks can rally around. It is well documented that brown and Black people died disproportionately by police. That is a tragedy and a legacy of racism and is wrong. However, the majority of people killed by police officers are white. Police shouldn't be killing Black people, brown people, or white people. What if Black Lives Matter made its demand more inclusive? The George Floyd bill would have saved brown lives, white lives, and Black lives. Now, I used to think religion influences our politics. That wasn't until after I read a book by a social scientist, Ryan P. Burge, a book called The Nuns. I realized it might be the other way around. He points out that politics is often the first cause and religious affiliation is downstream. He says most Americans pick a church that lines up with their view of the political world. Now, we can intellectually split up morality, religion, and politics, but I think in a lived, practical way, they're intertwined and linked together. Now, it is no secret that Unitarian Universalists lean to the left. Right? Right, no, correct, yeah. We tend to lean toward the left, yeah. Now, there are plenty of religious spaces in the North Country where conservatives and moderates are comfortable and welcome. We are one of the few liberal and progressive religious spaces in the North Country. Now, full disclosure, I side with progressive causes most of the time. Maybe you figured that out by now. Progressives are typically, politically left of liberals. According to a recent New York Times opinion piece by Pamela Paul, there is a rising rift between liberals and progressives. For example, liberals want equality between the sexes, while progressives want gender identity inclusion. Liberals tend to be against big business, but believe capitalism can be regulated, while progressives, capitalism needs to be replaced. Now, I don't go around blaming capitalism for everything. though I know many people who do. I think capitalism can and should be regulated. I don't go around thinking that police are the problem. It's this cultural system of racism and the militarization of the police that is the problem. The division between progressives and liberals becomes really apparent on whether you support Israel or Palestine. The coalition of the left is a bit shaky. Now, we Unitarian Universalists need to stay engaged in politics. We need to change and grow and evolve and support justice. But I am concerned that centrists and those left of center might not feel welcome in a UU church simply because of our political leanings. And just a reminder, progressives make up about 6 to 8% of the US population. For justice to happen, for a good and healthy congregation, we need large coalitions in order to bring about change. Anyone ever hear of the phrase, the narcissism of small differences? Okay. Some of you have. It was coined by Sigmund Freud over 100 years ago. It really means when a relationship or a community of people have a lot in common, but they tend to engage in interpersonal conflicts and ridicule each other because of small and minor differences. People need to find and exaggerate their differences. I think this is happening on the political left, and I've seen it happen in Unitarian Universalism. To be alive in this post-Black Lives Matter era is to know that racism is not just a few bad people, but there are systems and policies and laws in place that promote racial injustice. A culture of white supremacy is not the sinister individual skinhead with swastika tattoos. White supremacy is baked into the laws of our land. So part of the legacy, and I think the success of Black Lives Matter has changed our way of viewing the world and race and racism. And this, unfortunately, is how we really see the narcissism of small differences. Do you capitalize the B in Black? You can't say people of color, you need to say BIPOC, Black Indigenous people of color. My concern is that justice work gets trapped in virtue signaling, and justice becomes performative, a language game. We make public declarations to show our moral character and our social conscience, so we look good. I don't think that's why we put up a Black Lives Matter sign. That was a moment where our faith, our politics, and our morality intertwined and coalesced. Perhaps Black Lives Matter could have more centralized leadership and make achievable demands, which will engage mainstream politics and be able to push for policies that a large coalition can rally behind. My hope is that whenever the next train starts to pull off, we all stay with those who didn't or just can't get on quite yet. That we have the care, the patience to love people onto our train. As justice goes beyond virtue signaling, so love goes beyond small differences. After all, justice is what love looks like in public. Amen, and blessed be.